to take some stuff on. I'm going to go there. Let's go statues. So, unless you've been crawled under a rock recently, this statue, this slave trader Colston in Bristol, they ripped it down, they chucked it into the water, the river, whatever, next door. Is that okay? I get what it's like if you're, well, I don't get it, but I understand, I empathise with the police in that situation. Do they step in to be the police standing in front of a statue of a slave trader with a bunch of people protesting about racism? That's not a good look. But they allow it to happen, and then we have a whole rolling conversation about getting rid of a whole load of statues. Where and how do we decide what's good and what's not? Where and how do we decide who's good and who's not? Winston Churchill said some deeply racist things about India. He did some pretty awful things. Without him, potentially we're living under Nazi rule. Students in Liverpool they're arguing to get rid of William Gladstone because his dad had slaves. Not him, his dad had slaves. Now, Gladstone, one of our prime ministers, and if ever there's one of our politicians whose angels were greater than his demons, I think you could find people left and right of the political spectrum who'd say, Gladstone, good bloke. I have no idea why we'd be ripping down his statue. If his comes down, everyone's comes down. The only person whose statue will be left at this rate is Jesus. Muhammad had slaves. Okay, there's no statues of Muhammad because you're not allowed to do that. But Jesus is the only person who will survive the standard of statue ripping down. And you won't, and I won't. If we put statues of anyone alive now up, in 50 years, 100 years' time, they'll go, they did nothing about the trade inequalities in the world that kept the 2/3 world poor and 1/3 of the world rich. They didn't do anything about that huge climate change thing. They still drove a car that polluted it and lived on it, so we can't have them. I mean, no one, we're back to stuff, we're back to Jesus stuff. Someone calls Jesus good and he says there's nobody good but God. Now, part of the point he's making that he is God, but let's just put that aside now, because you might not agree with that. But who's good enough to be put on a pedestal? Because that's literally what a statue is. It's putting somebody on a pedestal. No one. So no statue will survive this. When somebody dies, we celebrate the good in their life and we forget the bad. That's the point. That's why the don't speak ill of the dead idea comes. You know, that's not from the Bible, but it's just something that's grown up. We look at somebody's life. You know, my father died 10 years ago. He was an imperfect man, but I try and live in his memory and live out the good things that he embodied, and I forget and say goodbye and forgive the crap and the rubbish. When we start this judgmental year zero, George Orwell, Man in the High Castle weirdness of just getting rid of statues, where does it end? And actually, maybe, just maybe, the police should have said, no, take this to the council, let's have a vote, let's work it out, and then let's take this down, and let's stick this statue, not in the bottom of the river, but in a museum, where people can learn and look at and say, hey, this guy, what did he do? Let's evaluate his actions and learn. Mob rule is not the right way. Even if the mob's doing the right thing. Who would you put on a statue? Who do you think is good enough by these standards? And what the heck are we doing at the moment? That's what I think. That's what I think applying my faith to the situation. But you tell me what you think. Give it a follow, give it a like. Tell us what you think.